Welcome to Making Chassidus Real. This is part 3. In this session, we're going to continue to discuss the concept of Bitul as we did last week, because it's such an important topic and often so confusing or perhaps overwhelming or threatening. And people seem a bit scared of the concept of Bitul. So what I want to do is I first want to give a brief summary of last week. And again, the discussion is on a very simple level without going into only deep Haskaladika Madregas of Bitul and so on and so forth, as discussed extensively in Chassidus. But just a very brief summary first, and then a few nakudas, which maybe we'll add this week to last week's discussion for further clarity and perhaps further practicality. So last week we had 3 nakudas, 3 points that we made. First is the definition of Bitul. This is really important because the starting point is to have the idea clear in our mind before we try to apply it, before we even try to apply part of it, to be intellectually honest and to really understand what the concept means. Not to water it down or to distort it because we find it difficult to relate to, but to have the intellectual honesty to understand what it really means, the way it's explained in Chassidus. On a very simple level, the definition of Bitul is complete surrender, self-nullification. That's the starting point, which, as we said last week, is the complete opposite to modern thinking, which the starting point is self. So much today is written about even sometimes good things, but the starting point is self, and that's problematic. I'm harping a little bit on this point because it's really important. That focus on self is creeping into everywhere nowadays, and it's dangerous, spiritually, ruchnistic danger. Secondly, we talked about the concept of matzah and chametz, where the starting point has to be matzah, because of course Hashem wants us, notwithstanding the concept of Bitul, He wants us to use the koiches that He gave us. He wants us to use our intellect, our chushim, our talents, our skills. But it's always going to be in the context of Bitul. The starting point is matzah, totally surrender. A mashahu chametz is treif. And only then we can reintroduce the chushim that we have in that context of Bitul and use them the way the Eibishter wants us to use them. First naseh, then nishma. First matzah, then chametz. But the starting point, again, the idea is the starting point is complete Bitul. And the third point we had is that we need to recognize that we all have an ego. We all have yeshus. That's a lifelong mission. It's difficult to become completely Bitul. We have a nefesh abamis. Nefesh abamis is naturally, without any experience, by very definition of its existence, is into self-preservation and into self, and it has a degree of yeshus at different levels, of course, but we have it. Step 1 is to just acknowledge that we have it. And step 2 is then to make a slow dent in how we serve Hashem by using the concept of Bitul, and understanding, by the way, that of course our neshama has natural Bitul, as it says in Tanya, and many places, and we have to recognize that we have within ourselves that power of Bitul to try and work with the nefesh habamis, sometimes being harsh to the nefesh habamis, sometimes breaking a little bit the nefesh habamis in order to bring concepts of Bitul into our routine, into our avodas Hashem. So today let's just add 3 ideas just for expansion of the discussion. First of all, just to a little bit talk more about the definition of Bitul. Secondly, how the idea of Bitul is not negative. People think it's a negative thing, it's not. And let's discuss some of the applications of Bitul again in our own little world. So, number 1, again, this is more of a hemshech of last week, but Bitul, of course, it's hard. Why is it hard? Because it's hard to let go of ourselves. But, as we said last week, just because it's hard to let go of ourselves, we should never engage in the redefinition of Bitul. Bitul is what Bitul is. Let me just add a few things. I heard from my Zayda Olav Shalom on my mother's side, a Rav in South Africa. His name was Rabbi Eloi. He came from Dokshitz, but he learned in Litvische yeshivas. He got to see the Frierdiker Rebbe only when he was older. He was about 19 already. And in Europe, he saw the Frierdiker Rebbe 4 times before he emigrated to South Africa and then once more in America. And he told me, and I think just that's a beautiful little story, but it brings out the point. He told me that one time he was in a town, one of the times he saw the Frierdiker Rebbe is when the Frierdiker Rebbe came to a town and he farbrenged at a particular night for soldiers that had been drafted into the army, that they couldn't avoid the preziva, they used to call it then, and they had a tough time and they were able to gather, and the Frierdiker Rebbe farbrenged for them. And he went to that farbrengen. He wasn't part of the army, but he went to the farbrengen and he was there all night, and he said he doesn't remember what the Frierdiker Rebbe said. He only remembers one thing, that many times throughout the night, The Friediker Rebbe said, "Medav zicha weglegen," which means, the most accurate translation, I think, is we have to take ourselves and put ourselves to a side. Medav zicha weglegen. That is Bitul, completely to put ourselves to a side. The Rebbe would always, often talk about the two girsas, the two versions of the Chazal that tells us, "Anini vresi l'shamish eskoini." I was created to serve my master. And the Rebbe would say that there's two girsas, there's two versions in that. One is Anini vresi, I was created l'shamish eskoini, to serve my master. The other one is Ani loy nivresi elo l'shamish eskoini. I was not created only to serve my master. And of course, the Rebbe explained that the one is deeper than the other. The first version is Ani nivresi, I was created, I exist. L'shamish eskoini. I exist to serve my master. Okay, it's Bitul, but it's one level of Bitul. But it's not the deep level of Bitul. The true Bitul is the second version. Ani loy nivresi, I do not exist. I'm completely bottle. Ella, my only existence, the only expression of my existence is l'shamish eskoini, to serve my master, to serve the Eibishter. My father, Olav Shalom, told me there was a famous Farbrengen, I believe it was in Tovshin Yud Beis, and he was a Bocher then. He came to the Rebbe in Tovshin Yud Aleph. There was a famous Farbrengen, I think it was a Shabbos Mavarchim, where the Rebbe, in the middle of the Farbrengen, told everyone to take their jackets and turn them inside out, and to take their hats and turn them upside down. And in fact, the Rebbe turned his own hat upside down. And he used to repeat this very often about that Farbrengen, that he was there. So I once asked him, I was a small child, and I said to him, what were you thinking? Like, what were the Chassidim thinking? Like, what's happening? What's going on? Is there any kavanah here? So he answered me and he said, the feeling among Chassidim was that the Rebbe, it was the beginning of the Nesius, the Rebbe was asking for total Ibergegebenkeit. I want you to give yourselves over completely. Whatever I'm going to tell you to do, that's what you need to do. I want you to be mine. That's another sort of expression of the concept of Bitul. Bitul means complete Ibergebenkeit, complete yielding, complete surrender, complete self-nullification. That's just, I wanted to add that just again for emphasis about being honest about what the definition of Bitul actually is. Now the second point is this, and I'm just reflecting on an experience that I had. I was at a Farbrengen a couple of years ago at a yeshiva where overseas, and we were discussing the concept of Bitul and some of these ideas, I was sharing some of these ideas, and a Bocher came to me afterwards and he said, that language is not going to work today. I said, what do you mean? He said, the language of Bitul you're talking is very harsh. To tell a Bocher today, to tell a young man today, doesn't exist, is nothing, that's very negative. And if you do that, you're going to be pushing people away. And I was taken a little bit by surprise. And I thought about it, and I said to him the following, and this is what I think needs to be discussed and needs to be highlighted. First of all, if we encounter people that are really struggling and they have real challenges, obviously we need to think about the language that we speak to them, and obviously anything we say always needs to be, in general, when we speak to people, we learn this from the Rebbe in a most amazing way. Obviously everything we say has to be uplifting and inspiring and positive and encouraging. That goes without saying. However, I think there's a confusion of topics, and that's what often happens. Right? Bitul is not about being negative. Yes, should we be negative to people? Absolutely not. We have to be inspiring and positive. But Bitul is not negative, and Bitul is not harsh. Obviously, we've got to choose the right words, but it's not a harsh concept. In fact, we know from Chassidim, and we know from what the Rebbe explains in Mamorim, that Bitul actually brings simcha. We saw this with great Chassidim who didn't make a fuss of themselves, who were very bottle, and they were the happiest people. The fact that they tried to exercise Bitul to the best of their ability and really believed that they were nothing and bottle completely, kula kamei kala chashiv, didn't take away from their simcha. On the contrary, Bitul is an inspiring idea. Bitul is a gift from Hashem to be able to become bottle. What I mean by that is, when we exercise Bitul on any level, or even if we just get the Bitul concept straight in our minds, what we're really saying is that we have the ability to remove the limitation of self. We are very mugbal. If the starting point is self, we are so limited, we are so insecure. Like the Tzemach Tzedek story, that the person said, Metretach mir in the Beis Medrash, and the Tzemach Tzedek said, who told you to spread yourself out? When we talk about Bitul, we lose the need to have to protect ourselves the whole time. because we are truly part of a greater reality. We're part of the Eibishter. We're part of the Eibishter's reality. It's like it explains in Tanya that the Bitul of the Neshama in Perek Yotes, that the Bitul of the Neshama is that the Neshama is always aspiring. The Neshama wants to become part of its source, part of its mocker, even though the Neshama knows that it won't have an independent expression at all. But that's what the Neshama wants to do. Because the Neshama doesn't want to have its independent expression, independent identity. The Neshama wants to become part of its source, of its mocker, of Or and Sof. Bitul is about becoming part of something much greater, having much greater tkifus, as the Rabbi explains in Sichos, having much greater potential because we're getting rid of the mugbal dika, of the hagbola dika self, absorbing much greater koiches because we're part of the bli gvul of the Eibishter's reality. We just need to bring that out, and we need to understand that, of course, we don't always feel it, we don't always do it, we don't always feel completely bottle. But to say that we shouldn't entertain the idea of Bitul, that think that Bitul it means I'm nothing and I'm low and I'm this, that's not humility, that's anivus shel sheker, that's being a shmata, that's not what anivus is. On the contrary, we're saying that I, as an independent person, kulla kameika lachashiv, I am taka nothing, because I'm part of the mocker, I'm part of Or and Sof, I'm like the Or and the Moir, and so on and so forth. We should not be scared of Bitul. Bitul is not negative. Bitul brings simcha, because simcha is peiros together. Simcha is bli gvul. We have much more of a connection to bli gvul when we remove the limitation of our own self. Now, of course, what does that mean in terms of application? Let's go to the third nakuda that we wanted to speak about today, just again expanding a bit on last week. So again, once we understand the idea of Bitul, we have to try and apply it. What does it mean to try and apply it? First of all, it means we have to push ourselves to grow. When we grow, and it comes from a point of Bitul, in other words, we know that we know we have koiches. The Alter Rebbe in Lekutei Torah uses a lashon which someone just showed me. The concept of Bitul is lasses heipach ma shehalev choimed. What does that mean? That's applying Bitul. You see, sometimes we don't feel the Bitul, but we know about it. And it's like the Alter Rebbe said, you have Chabad, then you have Nehi. In other words, the more we learn about it, the more we understand about it, we know we really believe that we need to put ourselves to a side. Then we're ready, we might not feel it, but we're ready to take a push. We're ready to get up a few minutes early. We're ready to maybe talk less dvarim b'teilim. We're ready maybe, each one in their own level. And here's the important thing, and that's why it doesn't have to be negative. Bitul doesn't mean that everyone has to be this unbelievably Chassidish Yid overnight, and if you're not, that means you're a big yesh and you're a garnished. No, it means that if you're ready to grow, and you understand the concept of Bitul, and you take where you are, and Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, B'chol dechiyah, every push you gave, every scuff, every time you do something you don't want to do, every time you learn a few minutes more you don't want to do, that's an expression of this very deep Bitul. And this is how we apply it, by knowing what it means in its pure sense, and then letting that pure concept, which maybe we can't reach, but because we understand what it really is, we're ready to give ourselves a bit more of a push, a bit more of a push in the right direction. That's one idea of how we apply it, just to grow, do something that's a little bit hard for us. Connected to that is a very important idea, and I'll just finish with this very bekitzur, and perhaps another time expand on it more. One of the things we find in the Rebbe's Sichos again and again this comes from the expression of Bitul. You know, when someone starts, when the starting point is self, even if a person wants to do the right thing, even if the expression of self is Torah or mitzvahs, and doing it because I think it's an important thing, and I want to be a person who has shleimus and perfection, and therefore I want to do Torah or mitzvahs. If the starting point is self, it'll always going to be growth in Torah and mitzvahs in things that I like. Things like, to use a modern expression, that talk to me, that resonate with me. Which is so opposite the concept of Chassidus. Now, of course, if the Eibishter gave us chushim and abilities, we should nurture them. But one of the things that the Rebbe talks about again and again in the Sichos is the idea of having both kavim, not to be locked into a particular kav, not to be locked into chesed or gvura. V'hamayim lohem choyma miminom u'mismoilam, the Rebbe says. When the Yidden went out of Mitzrayim, they had the wall from right and left because you have both kavim. The split hooves in an animal, the Rebbe says, the idea of the tooth kavim. The idea is that you have to be ready to do what you don't like. You have to be ready to daven even though davening doesn't work for you. or it's not talking to you. We have to be ready to go on miftzoim, even though maybe learning is what you like to do. You have to be ready to learn, even though miftzoim is what you like to do. Whatever covet is, that's the concept of zicha weglegen. Now again, do we feel bottled? Do we feel totally not locked in our kav? Of course not. But when we understand the idea, at least we're ready to make decisions, small ones even, but pushy ones. In other words, ones that we're going to challenge ourselves to grow. Challenge ourselves to grow, not only to grow in the things that we like, because that's self, to grow even the things that we don't like, because we understand the concept of Bitul. And that brings the greatest growth and the greatest simcha. And that's really an application in a very small way, each in our own small way, but it brings the application of Bitul. About going aris van zich a little bit, to go out of ourselves, to make room for others, to make room for things that I don't like, to make room for other opinions that I don't like, and so on and so forth. That is the application of Bitul in a small way, but it's inspired by the true understanding of what Bitul really is, how we are really completely bottled. Have a wonderful day and a good Shabbos.